All right, we have a big lesson ahead of us today, not necessarily long, but very important in our nation's history in that perspective. So we're going to start with Roman numeral 2, FDR and the New Deal, and this starts on page 438 in your textbook, page 438. Now, FDR, anytime you hear me use those three initials, I'm talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this man right here. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, if you may be wondering, he is a distant cousin to Theodore Roosevelt, but he is often referred to as FDR, so that's who I'm talking about whenever I use those three initials. Now, in the election of 1932, Herbert Hoover was running for his second term, but it was going to be a long shot. Now, this is different because normally in presidential elections, the incumbent, or the man who is in office but is running for a second term, normally they are at an advantage in an election. But sadly for Herbert Hoover, he was at a disadvantage because he was president during the start and the beginning phases of the Great Depression. And so he was running hard for re-election. But many of the people had already made up their minds that it was Herbert Hoover's fault, the Great Depression was, and that they were looking for someone else. And the Democratic candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was promising the people a new deal. Now, this is what's funny, because if you remember, Theodore Roosevelt, he was pushing for what we called the Square Deal. But his cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is now promising a new deal. And what he's promising here is he actually promised, and this is on page 439, that he would cut government spending by 25%. And he also promised that the government would try bold new experimentations with the economy to try to get us out of the Great Depression. This was music to Americans' ears. If you look on the map on page 439, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, won 42 out of the 48 states at the time, because by 1932 there were only 48 states. So he won 42 out of the 48. It says here that he had 472 electoral votes compared to Hoover's 59. He won in a landslide. It wasn't even close. And so FDR now goes about setting up his New Deal. Now, the New Deal had four sources, meaning four philosophies behind it. Okay, the first one was populism, which is a belief in farm relief and inflation, meaning give money to farmers so that they can plant crops and so that they can make new food. And even if that means inflating our currency. Even if you're printing off money that isn't backed by silver or gold, still give them money. Print off money to give to them. We see progressivism, the government regulation of business. FDR was a huge progressive that believed that government should regulate certain businesses. War mobilization. He wanted to attack the economy as an enemy. He said, we are going to mobilize our industries just like we did in World War I. We're going to mobilize our industries to attack this depression. And he also wanted a planned economy. He actually blamed economic woes on free enterprise. He said, it's partly capitalism's fault that we're in this position. And so he wanted a planned economy that was going to be regulated by the government. I want you to understand something. While the New Deal technically did somewhat provide relief for the Great Depression, it only solved certain problems in the short run. It affected the United States negatively in many areas in the long run. American government would never be the same after FDR's presidency and the implementation of the New Deal. It says in your textbook on page 439 that Roosevelt's presidency marked a shift from government non-interference and individual responsibility to a government-managed economy and the provision of state welfare. So we're now moving from a government philosophy of individual ruggedness, meaning you provide for yourself. You work hard, you can provide for your family, to if the government's going to provide for you. You know what? You've hit a hard time. The government's just going to give you money. And so now we begin to see a shift in philosophy from the American people of why work really long hours for little pay when I can do nothing and the government's just going to provide for me. All right, so that's what we see. We see a shift in philosophy. Now, the New Deal in action. Notice here that we have 6 bullet points and not a whole lot of description. So that means that you're going to have to write some important things, okay, next to each of these points. Let's start with number 1, bank holidays. Because Roosevelt noticed that the runs on banks where people were withdrawing a ton of money, it was putting banks out of business, he said, you know what? In order to prevent bank holidays, in order to prevent banks from closing their doors and people withdrawing a ton of money, we're going to have bank holidays, which means the banks are going to close their doors and not allow anyone in or to withdraw their money. So they called it bank holidays to put a positive spin on banks not allowing anybody to withdraw their money. Secondly, you have fireside chats. This is what I think is great about FDR. He knew that the people were worried. And he kind of took Herbert Hoover's optimistic approach, but even added to it. And President Trump is actually doing this now, but not by the use of the radio, by the use of the television. He's having daily talks with the media so that Americans can see updates on what's going on with the coronavirus. FDR did this by the use of the radio. So every night he would get on the radio and he would provide updates to Americans to let them know where America was in their fight against this economic depression. People called it fireside chats because oftentimes they would be listening to the radio by the fire. And so the family would gather together in the living room to hear the President of the United States come into their living room through the radio and give them an update. This is providing a personal touch, but also making Americans feel cared for and knowing that their president's doing all he can during this troubled time. Fireside chat, that's a great part of FDR's legacy, and I think that's the mark of a true leader. He did a great job with that. He also created these agencies in order to help put life into the economy. One of these agencies was called the Civilian Conservation Corps, and this was a part of your reading assessment on reading assessment number 6. The Civilian Conservation Corps, this is on page 442. This agency gave jobs to unemployed young men and conserved natural resources. It says here, during its existence, the CCC employed more than 2.5 million young men. The workers wore military-style uniforms and marched with picks and shovels like soldiers with rifles. And many of these men, and there's a special portion in the yellow box on page 442 about the Civilian Conservation Corps. These men were in charge of planting trees and trying to plant vegetables, do things to help conserve natural resources. The second group, the one that's important as well, is the Tennessee Valley Authority. That's the TVA. The Tennessee Valley Authority, that was created in order to provide public power projects on the Tennessee River. So a lot of the dams that they would create, they were hydroelectric dams that could produce and sell electricity, control flooding and erosion, and provide navigable waterways. It also manufactured fertilizer and created recreation areas. So the TVA was a huge organization that was able to hire many American men in order to work. They also put together telephone poles throughout rural parts of the United States so that people in the backwoods of the frontier, they could actually have telephones. So the TVA did a lot of things to help create new dams for electricity and other projects, giving men jobs to do while also paying them. We're not going to go over the Works Progress Administration. You can cross that one off. Social Security is another one. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture. I do want to let you know that as I've been going through these notes, I'm going to add more notes to chapter 22. So on Wednesday, which is today, you should be able to go to your stream page, and I will have uploaded a complete version of the Chapter 22 notes. So make sure that you download or print off those new notes that I will have uploaded onto your stream page on Wednesday, April 15th. Now, your homework tonight is to study Chapter 22 notes that we've gone over so far. So from the beginning of Chapter 22 to where we've stopped in this lecture. And you can cross off Works Progress Administration and Social Security. You don't have to study those. I'll go over Social Security in the next lesson. So make sure you study for that. Your quiz will be given to you on Thursday, April 16th. I hope everything's going well for you. I'm praying for you and your family for continued health and safety. Look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.